So, there are sometimes accusations made on this channel, in the comment section, that I shamelessly shill for Britain or something like that in the histories. I really don't. I really don't. You have to be very selective of the videos and have to have a very selective understanding of history to believe that, I would argue. But if any of you have that opinion of me, you're going to find this video very interesting, because we're going to be talking about the Fairey Barracuda. And this is a development program where if there is a rake in the grass anywhere, the British government, the Royal Navy, the Fleet Air Arm, the Air Ministry, everyone involved will find it and whack their face with it. Every single time. This is the most plagued aircraft development that I think you can find in World War II. I really do. That actually results in an aircraft which enters service. Okay? And I would say when it enters service, it's such a fudge that it's never going to be what it was wanted to be. It can never be what it was wanted to be. And it is a fudge, because things have kept being changed on it. And that's as much to do with timing as it is everything, because it's the timing of the scenario. I often think the Barracuda, kind of like the Royal Navy's attempt to get a fighter interceptor program, if the INSCIP award had been a year earlier in passing, and therefore all the movements and designations and the chances for the Navy to put in their own specifications had been moved a year earlier, you would be amazed at the Royal Navy which would emerge in 1940. It would have been close enough, none of the stuff would have been stopped, because it would have been useful, coming off the line and available. The trouble for the Royal Navy is everything was basically programmed in for 1941, because remember, war was supposed to not happen until 1942. That was the planning assumption the Royal Navy was working on, because that was the planning assumption they were allowed the funds to work upon, because the 10-year rule had officially ended in 1932 and had actually ended in terms of its effect on funding in 1937. Now, for those who don't know it, the 10-year rule had been the rule the British government had started off. A gentleman called Winston Churchill had been part of the process of coming up with it when he'd been Chancellor, of there wasn't going to be war for 10 years. And that rule had been made self-perpetuating. Yeah. So even with all the things the Italians are getting up to, even with all the issues with the Japanese in the Far East and pointing guns at each other, there's not going to be war for 10 years. There is not going to be war for 10 years. It happens. Politicians love to believe they can control the world. Honestly, all humans love to believe they can control the world. They love to believe that they have power over events. Realistically, you only have power over what you yourself do and how you react to things. That is really the way it is. That is realistically what you have power over. What you yourself do. In the case of this period, the politicians were also horror-struck, and there's a generation of leadership which is horror-struck over war because of World War I. They believe everyone else is the same. And that's a very, very bad assumption to make. That everyone else has drawn the same lessons, the same trauma, the same reaction to that trauma from events as you have. Humans react differently. Individuals react differently. As I've said before, when you're talking about an experience of being on a ship in combat, A person who is a stoker down in the engine room will have a very different experience of that combat event than the person who is in the medical bay, than the person who's on the bridge. They have a very different understanding of what happened. Their understanding is no less valid. Trust me, it can be just as traumatic in many ways, especially when you understand that one of the biggest causes of PTSD is people feeling impotent and weak in a circumstance where they have no control over events. It's one of the reasons why, when you're looking at PTSD and its effect, as a percentage, it is less likely to affect those who are more senior up the chain of command, because they have the illusion of more control over the events around them. This is not to say they are not affected. Again, not to say they are not affected. It's just statistically, as a percentage, they are less likely to experience it. And why am I bringing this all up at this point? Well, because unfortunately, those decisions they made and the delays put in directly impact the development of Britain's aircraft. And there is an entire cycle of aircraft which was supposed to come into service roughly 41, 42, which are either delayed, disbanded, destroyed as programs, or irrevocably altered. And that is all because of the impact of the war, and also some very short-sighted decisions taken at the beginning of the war. And there are a lot of short-sighted decisions taken in 1939, a lot of very short-sighted decisions taken in 1939, especially some which are based on the idea that the war will not expand in scope, that it will stay an Anglo-German, Anglo-Franco-German affair, that it won't expand, that the Italians won't get involved, that the Japanese won't get involved. There are so many assumptions made which are so bad and so deleterious for the war effort, that frankly, you often, if you are looking just at those decisions, you could ask the question, who are the governments working for? But the reality is, they are people trying to do their best in a very difficult situation, and they are making the choices they see best as they can. And they get some wrong. They're human. Big shock. None of us is perfect. And that's another thing which will happen today. I'm going to be talking about a lot of decision makers, a lot of people involved, and some of them are heroes. Already discussed Churchill. And I have those comments in my own channel quite regularly from people going, how can you be so rude about Churchill? Well, it's not being rude about Churchill to say he made mistakes. He got a lot right, he got a lot wrong. He was a human. He lived with the consequences of getting the things wrong. He might have tried to write the history books so that his reasoning for why he made those decisions got emphasized in the books, but that doesn't mean he doesn't realize he made mistakes. He made mistakes. But he's human. And here's the real kicker in all that. There isn't anyone better for the job at the time. Once you start to consider who has the necessary public support, the necessary support in the armed forces, the necessary support in Parliament, who has the necessary standing on the international stage to be Prime Minister, to be able to have the connections, have the reputation, have the position to lead Britain in that kind of time, in that conflict, you get to a very, very small list of people. A very small list of people. And of those options, Churchill's the best. But yes, let's start off with the Barracuda and the beginning of the story. And this is the point I want to make. Specifications are issued in 37. Push everything a year back, a year earlier, things actually could be better. For one thing, they might actually specify a better engine, but we'll get on to that in a bit of discussion. Now we're going to work through the actual specification, and for that, I need to grab a book. So as always, I will expand this for a second, so if you want to freeze the screen and read it, you can. And then I'll read it through. So, Of course, this comes from the lovely Meekham's and Morgan British Aircraft Specifications file. Now, first things first is both this and the aircraft before it, which is S.2437, which is the Special Observation Aircraft, the Night Shadow aircraft. Looks like that. It's a really interesting aircraft, but basically the Royal Navy had this idea for having a carrier aircraft which was a specialist night shadow aircraft which was ultra quiet and can track enemy at night. And yes, if World War II had intervened, it probably would have ended service. And that's just part of the Royal Navy's plans for how to get really nastily close to people in the middle of the night before going bang at them. I'm not saying the Royal Navy was preparing to be the naval version of a street mugger who liked to get in close, but yeah, they were. They were. Let's be honest, they were. Their entire plan was to get very close and then open up with everything. Not care if you lived or died, just take care of rob you in the middle of the night from close range, with every explosive they had available. But S-2437, torpedo bomber reconnaissance aeroplane for the Fleet Aeron. Finally dated on the 6th of January 1938. So it's part of the 1937 cycle of specifications, but it's actually finally issued in January 1938. And again, this is one of those things of, if it was a year earlier, there is so much more available to be developed. Now, the idea was to meet operational requirement OR-53, which basically said, look, we really do like the torpedo attack systems we have. We want to keep using the torpedo attack systems we have, but we need a better aircraft. We do need a better aircraft. And we know we've already spec'd the Fairey Barracuda the previous year, and we've upgrading the Swordfish the year before that, and various other things, and working on basically strike aircraft for the Navy almost every year from 1935 onwards. But we need something. We need something better. And so they want a single-engined monoplane required to combine the duties of dive bomber and reconnaissance and torpedo bomber reconnaissance. So it's supposed to be able to do dive bombing role and torpedo bombing role. Again, the Swordfish was theoretically a dive bomber as well, but its speed in the dive was sufficiently slow that it's more of a sort of helicopter bomber, where it just sort of hovers above the target and leisurely drops the bomb. Not a good position if you want to be actually safe from enemy AA fire, but a great method if you want to be accurate in dropping the bomb. You can be really accurate because you literally are pretty much standing still in midair. The airplane will operate primarily as a ship plane from an aircraft carrier. An alternative float undercarriage for use in sheltered waters will not be required to be constructed, but a provision should be made for it in the design. The aircraft, as a float plane, should, if possible, be able to carry out bombing and torpedo attacks. The all-up weight of the bomber load as a ship plane is not to exceed 10,500 pounds. As a float plane, the aircraft will not normally be required to operate at an all-up weight exceeding 11,500 pounds. Performance. The cruising speed must not be less than 185 knots at normal reconnaissance load. At the maximum continuous economic cruising power at the rated height of the engines, the stalling speed is not to exceed 58 knots. As a ship plane, if the reconnaissance case, an endurance of 6 hours at 2,000 feet at not less than 120 knots, and in the bombing and torpedo case, a range of 600 sea miles at 6,000 feet, plus 15 minutes at maximum takeoff power at sea level, in both cases is required. In order to provide a higher endurance when required, provision is to be made for an additional tankage to provide a maximum endurance of 8 hours at not less than 120 knots. The aircraft shall be fully equipped for night flying. Arrestor gear is to be fitted. The maximum catapult or accelerator speed is 66 knots. That's all quite useful. Now, one of the problems that you have in this design is not only do they keep changing what engine they're going to fit in the thing, they're also the weight keeps expanding. Because as time goes on, as the war goes on, you get more and more equipment you want to stick in the aircraft. And more equipment becomes essential that you put in, and the weight of airborne radar and all these things goes up, and as they get more advanced and more technologically capable, they tend to get heavier and take up more space. And this is one of the problems you will find. We're talking about weights here which are nowhere near what the final Barracuda will achieve. In fact, the all-up weight, well, it's nearly 2,000 pounds normally, more than the float plane all-up weight was supposed to be, a variant all-up weight was supposed to be, let alone the original planned one. Dimensions: height 14 foot 9 inches, length ship plane 40 foot, float plane 44 foot, span, that's the spread of the wings, 50 foot, folded 18 foot. Engine: the aeroplane shall be fitted with a British engine which shall have passed 100 hours service type test before delivery of the aeroplane. An air-cooled engine is preferred. A variable pitch air screw shall be provided. That's all nice. Armament: a wing Browning gun with 400 rounds of ammunition under the control of the pilot, a Vickers K-type gun with 1,000 runs for the air gunner, one 1,500-pound torpedo, or 6 250-pound, or 3 500-pound, or 6 100-pound bombs. So that basically means, okay, we need 6 hardpoints, plus the hardpoint configuration for mounting the torpedo underneath the aircraft. Crew: 3. A pilot, observer, and an air gunner. Remember, the air gunner is usually referred to as a telegraphist air gunner, or TAG, because they would also operate the radio, especially in reconnaissance mode. When you're going into two-person strike, the observer takes on the role of being telegraphist air gunner as well as observer, which translates as navigator, and person who's actually looking and trying to carry out the act of recognizance. Remember, the Royal Navy at this point has two phrases they use: reconnaissance and recognizance. Reconnaissance is, I reckon these things are there. I believe they are there. This is what I'm talking about. Recognizance is, I recognize what is there, as the Royal Navy, broadly speaking, translates it at the time. It's a fun, a bit of phraseology, and it does cause fun because the amount of sources which, when they translate the original sources into a book, change recognizance into reconnaissance because they just presume they are interchangeable phrases, and they're not. This occasionally causes me fun at conferences when I go, this is the source material and what the source material says, and someone corrects me, and then I produce the photo of the National Archives document and I go, nope, it says recognizance. It's a fun one. Wireless: R1082, T1083, and R110. That's pretty much all the nets you need for talking with ships, land operations, and other aircraft. It's a fairly comprehensive list. 5 firms. The Blackburn put in 3 different options: the B-21, the B-29, and the B-36. Fairey put in the Type 100, which goes on to become the Barracuda. Hawker put in the 2437, which is an incredibly interesting aircraft. Western put in the P-10/11. And Supermarine put in the Type 322. Supermarine Type 322 is going to be discussed in this video because it's an interesting one. Bristol also did a design study, but as far as we know, nothing came from that. But that doesn't mean it didn't. Okay, one of the interesting things we have is the fact that a number of the paper designs disappear. They get morphed into other programs. They get transferred to other work. They just don't make it far enough, so they don't succeed. It's very difficult sometimes to track how many actual submissions are made, because there can be things which are soft rejected as well as hard rejected. Sometimes they'll take the design to the Rear Admiral aircraft carriers or someone like that, and they'll go, this is what we're thinking about proposing. And he'll go, really? Or they'll take it to the Air Ministry or the Admiralty, and they'll have similar issues, because maybe the engine they want to use is an engine which no one wants to use, because logistically it's going to be another nightmare.
Fairey and Supermarine designs were approved for full prototype construction. The Supermarine design, nicknamed Dumbo, had a Merlin engine and folding variable incidence wings with slots and flaps. This was R1810 to contract number 976687-38, was first flown in February 1943, and R1815 shortly thereafterwards. Now, as you might have guessed, this entering service in 1943. For an aircraft spec'd in 1937 cycle, technically 1938, that's rather a long development. When you consider the average turnabout of aircraft from a spec to service entry is 2 to 3 years in this time period, you would be expecting something spec'd in 1938 to be entering service in 1941 and be in sufficient numbers by 1942. But this is one of the problems you have with the war coming in when it does, and people trying to curtail the work Supermarine is doing, Fairey are doing, trying to focus on just what they're producing now, trying to get them to be as efficient as they possibly can in their production, to maximize the ship aircraft which are already on production, which you already have production jigs for, so you can already produce. That is really taking up the precedence. And this is one of the reasons why these aircraft take so long to get into service. The contract for the Fairey design was actually placed on the 30th of January 1939 and was followed in July of that year with a production order for the Barracuda. The first prototype, P1767, to contract number 777067-38, was flown in the 7th of December 1940, and P1770 on the 29th of June 1941. However, the Barracuda was designed to operate on the Rolls-Royce 1200 horsepower X engine, which had to be abandoned, and so the prototypes and initial aircraft were powered originally by Merlin 30s, which proved to be underpowered, and this is where we start talking about the development of the Barracuda. The point is, there is an opportunity for the Royal Navy to get a very good aircraft. If you look at the Barracuda, if it enters service in 1941, it is a very, very good aircraft. Entering service when it does historically, it kind of isn't as good as it could have been. It isn't the aircraft which you need coming, it's more the Royal Navy catching up with everyone rather than being equivalent to everyone. And that is the story we're going to be looking at today in today's key aircraft. That is the history we're talking about. But first, I wanted to start off by talking a bit about the Dumbo, because the fact that a Supermarine aircraft was referred to as the Dumbo is just something so cute to me. It just is. Now, why do I want to talk about the Supermarine Type 322 Dumbo in a video about the Barracuda? Well, because the whole process was kind of innovative, and this was one of the more innovative entries. And for this, I am going to, of course, Supermarine Aircraft since 1914 by C.F. Andrews and E.B. Morgan. It's a very good little book. And it's one of the advantages of being able to record these videos in my office now that I can have all my books out. I can grab them all. So, here is the interesting point, a line here. Joseph Smith, who had succeeded R.J. Mitchell as chief designer of Supermarine, favoured the variable incidence wing principle since it provided such an excellent view for the pilot, a feature so lacking in many designs. With slots open and flaps down, a maximum lift coefficient of 2.6 was aimed at. Full span slots and part span slotted flaps were deemed necessary to achieve this figure, but with the added introduction of slotted ailerons, a maximum lift coefficient of 3.9 was registered, with engine on and a corresponding 57 miles per hour stalling speed. Very few aeroplanes had reached such a high figure. Even the maximum lift coefficient of the Lysander was only 2.38. Now, lift coefficient matters because
It can affect all sorts of parts of an aircraft's performance, its efficiency in the air, its operation, and its ability to land in small spaces and take off in even smaller ones. It's wonderful. So lift coefficient matters. And an aircraft which was nicknamed the Dumbo because of its elephantine shape is an interesting aircraft to have such an efficient scenario. They also had a very small wing. In fact, I can tell you this looking at the Supermarine option. Whilst I think ultimately the odds are they would have provided the fighter for the Royal Navy and not the torpedo bomber. I do think if this had started a year earlier and R.J. Mitchell had been involved as well as Joseph Smith, well, how do I put this politely? More involved, I should say more involved, then there is a goodly chance that this aircraft does get selected. There is a goodly chance it gets selected from further development. And I do find it interesting that it was designed with the Merlin engine, with its lift coefficient, with the way it's designed and shaped, its operational capabilities. It could have actually made better use of the lower powered Merlin engines that were available earlier on to achieve the desired aims, which would have meant, as it was designed from Merlin from the get-go, it would have had less of a problem entering service. Now, the bottleneck would have been Merlin engine production. Similar issues as was had with the Fairey Fulmar. But again, if you have it coming in earlier, then hopefully you've adjusted production capacity to deal with the new required aircraft. It also would have made an interesting thing of if it was using Merlin engines and Fulmars were using Merlin engines, then actually the sheer amount of supplies which you're going to be getting out and the effort you're going to put into supplies for engines for two types of aircraft operating from your carriers is going to be that much greater. So there shouldn't have been the supply issues. But yeah, this is a really intriguing little aircraft, and along with some of the other options from Supermarine that were being put at the time, do give you a real tantalizing option of the Royal Navy producing an all-Supermarine carrier air group in the early stages of the war, if some other little decisions had been made and some other progress had been achieved. But this aircraft, the reason it was delayed was, again, it was Spitfire came first. Spitfire had to come first, and you can disagree and agree with that decision. I find it annoying that the fighter program for the Seafire was cancelled, but I can also understand why. Supermarine was part of Vickers, but they were not the largest part of Vickers. They were a small niche aviation manufacturer within Vickers' whole conglomerate, and they only had so much they could do. They only had so many people available, and that's the problem ultimately. But yeah, this is a good book, by the way. If you can get a copy of it, it's a good book. Like the Meekums and Morgan book I mentioned earlier, they're both very good books. So let's consider some of the other options, because it seems unfair to just talk about one and not talk about the others. Now, much as with Supermarine, there are books available from that same series, which specialise in all these different manufacturers. And I've done videos where I've talked about those books in the past. For these aircraft, most of the issues that come down to them is as innovative a design as they are, as interesting options as they are often, how to put this, limited by the production capacity of the firms proposing them. And that's one of the really interesting things looking at it, is the British are straining from about 1937 onwards to increase production capacity, to increase the ability of their manufacturers to build aircraft, to facilitate the construction of them. And yet still, even in 1938-39, they are very much hitting ceilings and going, okay, we would love to take this design forward, but frankly, this manufacturer doesn't have the capacity to produce it if we select it. So there's no point in us looking at it. There's no point in us looking at it. And yes, the Shadow Factory program hadn't really taken up maximum form yet at this point. It would get there, but it wasn't yet there. Let's be honest, most Fairey Swordfish during World War II are built by Blackburn. But it's coming together.
but it's not there yet. And so it's a factor in the decision-making process, and that's honestly why Hawker's 2437 and this aircraft, which is, again, an interesting one, and one of the options which has one of the more interesting positions of the wing, because it's not low wing on the aircraft, but it's not as high as it could be either. For various reasons, they have that as their idea, and again, engine selection. And one of the interesting things is the aircraft which have the Bristol, the air-cooled engine, rather than liquid-cooled engines, none of them are selected for development. None of them go forward. So, let's start off with looking at a shameless book plug before we get into all the engine discussions. So, shameless book plug time. Well, it's the part in the video where I make a shameless plug for the book, which I have out. There are others coming soon, where I update viewers if there are any updates coming up. For some of you who have been asking questions recently about where the prizes from the previous competition have gone, they are now out of the box that they were in. Okay, they got packed up in the moving boxes before they could get sent, and then I got ill, so I didn't manage to unpack them before they got moved. And now they've been moved. It's taken me a while to find the exact box they were in, because it was at the back of a lot of other boxes which were labelled for my office. And now they've been found, and then I went to Japan, and now it's going to be sorted out, and those are going to be sorted out soon. And then the next competition is not going to be started till Christmas time. And there is another competition coming, but I wasn't going to start a new competition until I got the prizes for the old competition gone and off to people who were going to have them. What else was I going to do? What else was I going to say? Yes, there's as I've said before, there's a public event coming on November the 13th. And that's going to be a really interesting talk. I look forward and hope many of you are going to be there. If you can bring friends, bring friends. Tickets are open at the King's College London website. It's going to be at King's College London on the Strand in the evening on the 13th. And it's going to be a really fun event. Usually we go for pizza or something afterwards, so again there's going to be that. And I hope to see many of you there. If you can't be there in person, there is the online, you are able to sign up to see it online, and I hope to see a lot of you there. And the Historiathon is coming. It will be, all fully details will be out soon, but yes, it's all coming. With that being said, let's start off with the Rolls-Royce X, aka the Boreas. aka an X-block sleeve valve engine. Always a fun idea. Now, an X-block has a theoretical advantage, because theoretically you can, for the same number of valves as you can get on a V-block engine, you can be half the length. Roughly. However, the complexity, the density, the weight, the power-to-weight ratio of it, due to all these factors, and did I mention the complexity of the machining, mean that the X-block engine, whilst being this theoretically wonderful, amazing, super solution to all our problems, it actually usually turns out to be rather not the solution to the problems. That's why when you consider many of the X engines which are produced during World War II, they don't actually enter service, or if they do, they're not used in that many aircraft. Look, on paper, in theory, it is a wonderful solution to so many problems, and if you could get it working, eventually you could probably get the power density to a level which would be extremely useful. However,
For the needs of World War II and the production capabilities of World War II, specifically the machining and manufacturing and metallurgical properties of World War II, this was a theory too far. And it is therefore rather unsurprising that the first developments of the Barracuda kind of get annihilated by this. And then you need to redesign the aircraft, because now the engine is going to be a lot longer. A lot longer. It's one of the interesting things. When you consider that the X block was supposed to be a 24 valve engine, 24 cylinder. Sorry, I said 24 valve, didn't I? 24 cylinder engine. And so it would be 6, 6, 6, 6. Well, to get it working, after they've done some testing on a Fairey battle, they moved to the Rolls-Royce 12-cylinder V-type. So instead of you having 4, you have a V of type of twin banks. And this was the Rolls-Royce Merlin 30. Now, the Rolls-Royce Merlin 30 is a rather interesting engine in itself. It's probably the first generation of engines which are really designed, of the Rolls-Royce ones, which you can really say are fully designed or adapted around the idea of low-level operations, which makes sense for a naval aircraft. They do. It makes sense for for you to have something adopted to this. But the thing is, you had been designing this aircraft around a 24-cylinder engine, which had a lot of grunt, and was in theory going to have a lot of power. In theory, it would have had a lot of power. In practice, there is a debate as to how much power it did have. We know the first ones they were testing out, they had roughly 1100 horsepower at roughly sea level. But the thing is, those are the first ones. And theoretically, you can scale them up, especially once you add in the superchargers and the various other systems you can add in, and the fact that they're going to have so many they are going to have so many cylinders. Again, I kept wanting to say valve, didn't I? No idea why I keep saying valve instead of cylinder. This is now the third attempted recording, and I keep making the same thing, so I do apologize. My brain is keep replacing cylinder with valve. And it's worthwhile thinking that the X doesn't go away. It evolves into what is known as the Rolls-Royce Pennine, which is a 46-litre 24-cylinder X-type engine. The X had been 22 litres. X had been 22 litres. And it did fly, by the way. It had flown in some Fairey battles. The Rolls-Royce Merlin 30, it was coupled with a three-bladed de Havilland propeller. And this is the Barracuda Mk I. And when they are testing it, it is underpowered, especially as the aircraft has grown in weight. And it is just not good. And again, despite it being a Fairey aircraft, the actual aircraft built are only 18 by Fairey and 5 by Westland. They're used for trials and testing and all sorts of things. They found that the Barracuda works great, works really well. When you're doing things like landing on carriers, etc., the Barracuda is very good at that. But the moment you start loading it up with weapons, it's just not powerful enough. It's just not powerful enough. And realistically, it's not that far away from being powerful enough, but it just isn't powerful enough. It just isn't powerful enough. And you have to redesign the airframe at the front of the aircraft. You have to design a lot of the weight bearing every time you change an engine. And this is a problem. This is a problem. Eventually you get to the Barracuda Mk II. And this is powered by the Merlin 32, which is another low altitude version of Merlin. And how it's been organised for low altitude? Well, much with the Merlin 30, it's had a cropped supercharger impellers, so that increases power at low altitudes. It does this by maximising basically the flow and rate for a certain altitude, a certain density of air pressure, or rather, air thickness. I'm trying to work out what's the fluid dynamics of the air. There's a lot of, the historian in me was warring with the knowledge of engineering and going, there is a phraseology for this, but it's just not coming. Doesn't fit properly. None of them do. It was fitted with a Kaufman engine starter, and again, these are the variants for the Fleet Air Arms types, but realistically, this aircraft is equipped with a 4-bladed propeller rather than a 3-bladed propeller to maximise the efficiency of the engine, and the Merlin 32 is 1600 horsepower. In simple terms, it's got roughly 400 horsepower more than the Merlin 30. And that makes a massive difference in the operating capability of the aircraft. And that's why the Barracuda Mk II is the one which is actually seen in service and actually produced a lot. And there are nearly 1,700 of those produced. Fairey build 675, Blackburn build 700, Bolt & Paul build 300, and Westland build 13. Westland seems to sometimes get in these little orders of a few aircraft. You sit there and go, is it almost worthwhile you setting up the jigs and things to build the aircraft when you're just going to build that few? But there again, it does spread out the knowledge. And from that point on, they start building more and more aircraft, and the Barracudas get slowly better and better engines for them. The Barracuda 2 carries the ASV radar, the anti-air-to-surface radar, and various other systems to try and make it more successful. The Barracuda Mk III is the ASW version. It carries all sorts of fun things, including variations of the air-to-surface radar and those systems to assist it. And there are further 850 of those produced, split fairly evenly between Fairey and Bolt & Paul. Barracuda Mk IV is a drawing board as far as we know, primarily example, but there are rumours that there was a Mk III modified to test out some of the ideas, but realistically it was changed very quickly to the Barracuda Mk V, which was going to incorporate the Rolls-Royce Griffon engine. That allowed for far more power and far more duty, and well, the problem is though, again, they've barely got those under production, and European theatre of war is over. In fact, only 37 have been built by Fairey by the time that happens. And yeah, they are useful aircraft, but they are shaped by the engines, and they are shaped by the story of their engines in terms of their serviceability. And this leads us to basically the end of the aircraft. Now, when the Barracuda enters service in 1943, it's very much welcomed by the Royal Navy, by Fleet Air Arm. They're going, wow,
hey, this is a fairly useful aircraft. But realistically, it is 2 years late. It is 2 years late. It is an improvement over the albacores they are using, especially in certain theatres, but it is 2 years late. And it doesn't serve for long. It does not serve for long. It's an interesting and capable aircraft in so many ways. And the operations it does carry out in World War II are some of the most interesting airstrikes the Fleet Air Arm gets up to in the latter parts of World War II. But still, there is a reason why the Royal Navy and the British Pacific Fleet re-equip their squadrons with Grumman Avengers. Because the thing is, the Avenger, for all its issues, and it does have issues, it's not a perfect aircraft, there's no such thing as a perfect aircraft. Its issues are that it has been constantly being tinkered with and upgraded, and came in at appropriate time and has been approved and improved with various modifications at periods where realistically the Barracuda has been fighting to enter service to its original specification, written back in 1937. Okay, technically published in 1938, but very, very close. And that's a problem. You see, because if we evaluate an aircraft by its war service, realistically you don't get the accurate impression of the Barracuda as an aircraft. You get a truthful, because it's historically accurate, impression of the aircraft, but not an accurate impression of the aircraft, because, again, it is a victim of the decisions taken by Britain and the government and the Navy and a lot of people who are making earnest decisions, let's be honest. You know, no one takes the decision of the 10-year rule because they think, oh yeah, we want to make our nation weaker. We want to put our nation in a bad position. No, they're thinking, we don't want to spend money we don't need to, so we don't want to put the strain in the economy we don't need to, so that we can focus on developing the things we do need to develop. We can focus on growing the economy in the ways we need to grow it, so we can better secure the nation. That's what they're doing. And it's like the same decisions about closing down shipyards and paying shipyards to close at the same time as, well, one department of government is doing that, at the same time as another department of government is running around shipyards going, please, please stay open, we need the capacity. The fact is, these are fundamentally human organizations. Fundamentally human organizations. And I'd say one of the problems you have with all of this stuff going on is the politics in it all. You see, one of the things I noticed when I was doing my PhD thesis on development of naval aviation in the 20s and 30s is that there's a lot of play made of Royal Air Force, Royal Navy for control of the Fleet Air Arm, and, you know, how the RAF mistreated the Fleet Air Arm. Realistically, that's not the story, that's not the history. History is, all aviation is put into the Royal Air Force and put under the control of the Air Ministry. And that's fine for about the first decade. Why? Because realistically, the Air Ministry and the Royal Air Force are focused on securing themselves against what are their external threats to survival, rather than necessarily their internal divisions. However, in the early 1930s, it starts to become more and more about the bomber will always get through. And instead of this being something which is being used as a cudgel to fight the other services and fight for funding for the Royal Air Force to defend them against the avariciousness of other services when it comes to the funding battles, it's actually being used internally. And that's when you start to see the problems with not just the Fleet Air Arm, but with Coastal Command, with Fighter Command, with Army Corporation. There is a reason why Britain goes into World War II, and we're pretty much the only major power which isn't operating a modern dive bomber. And just look at some of the old aircraft pulled out of service, Hawker Hart light bombers, etc., to provide a dive bombing capability in 1939, 1940. That's not because Britain is not producing modern aircraft, it's because the only dive bomber the British government have actually produced was the Blackburn Skewer, and the Fleet Air Arm and the Navy only got that through by claiming it was a fighter. And specifically they had to produce the Blackburn Rock variant of it, which is this turret fighter, which is such a heavy turret on it, it's actually slower than most of the aircraft are supposed to engage. This is a political nightmare. And don't worry, the other services have their own issues. They have their own sections which get powerful. The Royal Navy's okay, mostly because Admiral Henderson, who's the third Sea Lord, manages to balance the various factions to make sure that there's an adequately balanced navy being put through in a way which demonstrates surprising aplomb and requires a huge amount of political skill to internally manage it. But that's one of the reasons why the Royal Navy is as balanced as it is when it goes into World War II. Yes, does it have enough of anything it needs? No. Capital ships, carriers, cruisers, destroyers, sloops or submarines. There is literally not a single category it has enough ships, but it has enough of them to be able to function. It doesn't have enough of them to be able to do all the tasks it needs to do, but it has enough of them to be functional. And there is a requirement there. But the biggest impact of all these long-term decisions, realistically, are felt in the long lead items. Engine production. They are felt, engine development as well as engine production, but mainly engine production. Whether you're talking about for ships or for aircraft. Yes, it grows mightily during World War II, but there is a weakness at the beginning. And that is because of the lack of investment going on when there needed to be investment going on. It's an interesting period with all the treaties and all the discussions going on, but again, there are ways to fund, ways to ensure there is excess capacity in the system. You can make it so that people buying private aircraft, if they're buying engines which are, let's say, the most modern engine types, the newest engine types, don't have to pay tax on them, or things like that. There are ways to do so, to carry out, to encourage investment. But none of this was really pushed through. None of that had really been pushed through. And that's a problem. The other thing is the Royal Navy, Britain as a whole, had failed to recapitalise its merchant fleet as much as it needed to in the 20s and 30s. Again, if you want to keep the yards going, if you want to keep them employed and don't want to build warships for the Navy because of treaties, you need to ensure there's a healthy throng of merchant ship production going through. And how do you do that? Well, again, it's going to be tax breaks. They are a blunt tool, but they are one of the few tools in a government arsenal that can directly affect industry without you trying to mandate what the companies do. You either have the stick method of, this is the law, you have to do it this way, or you can do the carrot method. And the carrot method on companies is, here's a tax break. By the way, you build a new ship, you can write off the cost of that ship over the first 5 years of its use against your, operating profits, or your profits, or things like that to reduce your tax bill. There are options. Again, but not done. And why does this all have an impact on the Barracuda story and the Barracuda history? Realistically, it probably more has an impact on the Supermarine Dumbo, the Type 322. Why? Because that's got a Merlin engine and is delayed because of the Merlin engine. To an extent, though, again, the Barracuda fitted with a Merlin engine quite quickly. It needs a more powerful Merlin engine, and thanks to the Schneider Cup and various other races, the Britain had been doing quite well in the horsepower race in terms of development of engines, but hadn't really managed to develop the production of them, because not enough aircraft had been being built, so the facilities hadn't grown. And again, the facilities you have in peacetime, they are your base level for growing in wartime. The higher you make them, the easier it is to grow to the capacity you need for war. It's the same with everything. Your pre-war facilities, your pre-war capabilities, are your baseline. The smaller they are, the smaller the foundation you have to grow from. And that can be seriously limiting. In the case of the Barracuda, it was. The Barracuda could have been very good. Could have been very, very good. But it needed to enter service in 1941, and that meant it needed available Merlin engines in 1941, because, trust me, there is enough development going on, there is enough work going on, that if the Barracuda 1s had been produced with a proper engine, with the engine they needed, they would have been made available as quickly as possible. And honestly, if there had been enough Merlin production going on, it hadn't caused about 8-month differing between the X failing and them deciding on what they're going to do. Again, you can move forward production and service entry in even large numbers to 1941. And that has an effect on things. If the Royal Navy has a faster, more powerful, more capable strike aircraft for its carriers in 1941, that gives the Royal Navy the capability it needs to fight the opponents it's facing. It puts them in a better place when it comes to Mediterranean. It puts them in a better place when it comes to Operation C and the Japanese raid into the Indian Ocean. It puts them in a better place when it comes to all sorts of circumstances. It probably means the Albacore leaves service even more quickly. I don't think it probably has any effect on the Swordfish because of that ease of construction and maintenance. There are so many second and third line roles, which frankly the Swordfish is the perfect aircraft for, the perfect blend of being cheap enough, capable enough, and easy enough to use and fly and maintain, that frankly nothing's getting rid of it anytime soon. But that didn't happen. And it didn't happen, and I know I've been labouring this point, but there is a reason, it'll be revealed when I get to this other question. It didn't happen because of the capacity of construction of engines and of development of engines. And that owes its reasoning, its scenario, to the decisions made in 1920s and 30s. Pretty much the lesson from all this is that long-term decisions matter. we don't just shape the future of conflict, we shape our capabilities for the future of conflict with the decisions we make today for the effects of 10, 20 years. And you cannot quickly reverse those scenarios when you get into war. I'd say the lesson from the Barracuda is investing in industrial capacity never hurts. Finding a way to make others invest in your industrial capacity for you, though, that is the real key to success. And so here is the question. Let's say the Barracuda, with its ability to do a 70-degree dive and various other interesting things, does enter service in 1941 with an excellent variant of the Merlin engine providing enough power. Rolls-Royce Merlin providing enough power. So not soon enough to change things like Taranto, but meaning that instead of albacores going out on aircraft carriers and being the new aircraft coming in, the Barracuda is the aircraft coming in. The interim aircraft doesn't really get a shot. What do you think happens? How does the world change? Or does it all stay the same? Does it have an impact on what the Americans end up doing with their developments going on, and the Japanese? Or does it not? Be really interested to hear what you think. With that being said, this video goes out on, I think, the 31st of October. Which means it's President Jimmy Carter coming. It's President Jimmy Carter. That's going to be a fun one. I thought I'd talk about how a nuclear naval officer and how his style of the nuclear navy leads into his time in the White House. And there is a connection there. For good or for ill, there is a connection in how he approaches things with a nuclear navy experience. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and take care. If you like the videos, please do like, share and subscribe. It really does help the channel grow. Thank you very much.